The cornstalks stood like skeletal fingers against the merciless August sun, and their brittle leaves rustling with each labored breath that escaped Josephine's cracked lips. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress, where the bullet had torn into her thigh 3 hours earlier, leaving a dark trail behind her as she stumbled deeper into the abandoned field. Her bare feet, cut and swollen from the night-long flight across rocky terrain, could barely carry her pregnant body another step. At 19, Josephine looked far older. Her face gaunt from months of fear, her auburn hair matted with sweat and dirt, her green eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing death rides close behind. 9 months of carrying this child had been 9 months of planning this escape. And now, with her belly tight and cramping in ways that meant only one thing, she realized she might have waited too long. A rifle shot cracked across the prairie closer than the last. Abel's voice carried on the wind, rough and cruel. "You can't run forever, girl. That baby belongs to our family." Josephine pressed her back against a rotting fence post and slid to the ground, her hands instinctively protecting her belly as the first real contraction seized her like a vice. The pain was different now, deeper, more urgent than the practice pains she'd felt for weeks. This was it. The baby was coming, and she was alone in a field with 3 armed men, closing in, men who would kill both her and her child, rather than let their dark secrets see daylight. Another gunshot, and this time she heard hoofbeats pounding closer through the corn. Her fingers found the small kitchen knife she'd grabbed during her escape, pitiful protection against rifles, but all she had. As another contraction built like a gathering storm, Josephine closed her eyes and whispered the prayer her mother had taught her before the fever took her. "Lord, if you're listening, don't let my baby die for their sins." The wind carried the acrid smell of dust and dried corn husks, mixing with the metallic scent of her own blood. Each breath felt like fire in her lungs, and her vision blurred at the edges from exhaustion and blood loss. She could hear them calling to each other, now Abel's commanding bark, Marcus's deeper growl, Tom's higher-pitched excitement. They were coordinating their search, moving through the field like wolves closing in on wounded prey. "Found her tracks." Tom's voice carried triumph. "Fresh blood heading deeper into the field." "Good," Abel replied, his tone cold and calculating. "Marcus, circle around to the north side. Tom, stay on the blood trail. I'll come up from the west. She's wounded and heavy with child, she can't have gone far." The casual way they discussed hunting her down, as if she were nothing more than an escaped animal, sent a chill through Josephine's body that had nothing to do with the approaching evening. These men had once sat at her dinner table, eaten food she'd prepared with her own hands, slept under the same roof. Now they spoke of her capture and murder with the detached efficiency of professional killers. Another contraction hit stronger than before, and Josephine bit down on her sleeve to muffle the involuntary cry that escaped her lips. The baby was definitely coming now. She could feel the pressure building, the inexorable force of new life, demanding to enter a world that seemed determined to destroy it before it could draw its first breath. Through the gaps in the corn stalks, she caught glimpses of movement, the flash of a brown hat, the glint of sunlight on rifle metal, the steady approach of boots through dried vegetation. They were getting closer, tightening their circle with practiced precision. Abel had been a sergeant in the Union Army during the war, and he'd taught his brothers the same systematic methods he'd learned hunting Confederate guerrillas through the Missouri countryside. "She's got to be around here somewhere." Marcus called out, his voice uncomfortably close. "Trail's getting fresher." "Keep looking," Abel commanded. "And remember, we need her alive long enough to deliver that baby. After that." He let the sentence hang unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Josephine closed her eyes and tried to think past the pain and fear. She needed help, but there was nowhere to get it. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and she'd never make it that far in her condition. The main road was 3 miles in the opposite direction, but that's where they'd expect her to go. Her only advantage was that they thought she was running blindly, driven by panic and maternal instinct. They were wrong about that, at least partially. Yes, she was terrified for her unborn child, but she wasn't running blindly. During the long months of planning her escape, she'd studied every inch of this territory, memorizing landmarks and escape routes, identifying places where a desperate woman might find temporary shelter or concealment. This abandoned cornfield had been one of her backup plans, a place to hide if her primary escape route was compromised. What she hadn't planned for was going into labor in the middle of her flight. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks, but stress and physical exertion had apparently triggered early delivery. Now she was trapped in a nightmare scenario, giving birth alone, while being hunted by 3 armed men who wanted to sell her child and eliminate the only witness to their crimes. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she dreaded the moment when her pregnancy would become too obvious to hide, when Abel and his brothers would begin making their final preparations for the birth. She'd feared being trapped in the house, helpless and vulnerable, while they carried out their monstrous plan. Now she was free of that immediate threat, but facing something potentially worse, dying alone in a field, while her child died with her. Another contraction built, slowly peaked with excruciating intensity, then gradually subsided, leaving her gasping and shaken. They were coming faster now, maybe 5 minutes apart. She didn't have much time before the baby would demand to be born, whether she was ready or not. Wait. Tom's voice cut through her thoughts. I heard something. Sounded like a woman in pain. Josephine's heart stopped. She'd been careful to muffle her cries, but the last contraction had been so intense that some sound must have escaped, despite her precautions. Oh, where? Abel's voice had sharpened with interest. Southwest of my position, maybe 100 yards. Move toward it, but careful. She might have a weapon. What kind of weapon could she have? Marcus asked with casual contempt. She's a 19-year-old girl who's been running all night. Probably can barely stand up, let alone fight. Don't underestimate desperate women, Abel replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he'd learned that lesson the hard way. They're capable of things that would surprise you when their children are threatened. The approaching footsteps grew closer, and Josephine realized with dawning horror that her hiding place among the corn stalks wouldn't conceal her much longer. The dried vegetation provided visual cover, but it wouldn't muffle the sounds of childbirth, and it certainly wouldn't hide her from a systematic search. She needed to move, but where the field stretched for acres in every direction, offering plenty of space to hide, but no real shelter or protection. Beyond the field lay open prairie, even more exposed and dangerous for a woman in labor. The only substantial cover was an abandoned grain shack at the field's eastern edge, but reaching it would mean crossing open ground under hostile observation. A new sound reached her ears, different from the voices of her pursuers, subtler and more cautious. Someone else was moving through the corn, but with a different rhythm, a different purpose. This wasn't the heavy, confident tread of men hunting prey. This was something else entirely. The rustling of corn stalks wasn't random. It followed a deliberate pattern, careful and controlled. Josephine pressed herself lower against the dirt, clutching her knife as the footsteps grew closer. Through a gap in the withered stalks, she saw him, a tall, lean figure moving with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in wild places. His weathered bronze skin marked him as Indian, probably Lakota, from the style of his hair, long black, streaked with silver and braided with small bones and carved beads. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt, both travel-worn but well-maintained. A leather pouch hung at his side, and his dark eyes scanned the ground with the intensity of a tracker reading stories written in bent grass and scattered earth. The man moved like water flowing around obstacles his feet, finding the quiet spaces between dry leaves and brittle stalks. Everything about him spoke of experience in wild places, the way he tested each step before committing his weight, the way his head turned to catch sounds that others would miss, the way his hands remained loose and ready near the tools at his belt. Wikasa had been following the old Santee trail for 3 days, gathering white sage for a healing ceremony his nephew needed after a bad fall from his horse. The particular variety that grew in this valley was especially potent. His grandmother had taught him to recognize it by the silver undersides of its leaves and the sharp, clean scent it released when bruised. He'd made this journey many times over the years, usually without incident. But today was different. For the past hour, he'd been hearing sounds that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the prairie, human voices carrying over long distances, the crack of gunshots, and underneath it all, something that made his healer's instincts prickle with concern. Someone was in pain, real pain, and that called to something deep in his nature that he couldn't ignore. His people had many names for what he was: medicine man, healer, keeper of the old ways. But the white men who occasionally sought his services simply called him Indian Doctor, and that was enough for most purposes. What mattered wasn't the name, but the responsibility that came with the knowledge passed down through generations of his family. When he pushed through the last row of corn and saw Josephine, his experienced eyes took in the situation immediately. The young white woman was in active labor, bleeding from a gunshot wound and close to collapse from exhaustion and blood loss. Her face was pale except for the fever-bright spots on her cheeks, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. Everything about her condition screamed urgent medical attention, but they were miles from the nearest doctor or midwife. More troubling were the sounds he'd been hearing: men's voices calling back and forth, coordinating some kind of search. This woman wasn't just in medical distress. She was being hunted. Josephine saw him and scrambled backward, raising her knife with trembling hands. "Stay away from me. I won't let you take my baby." The words confirmed his suspicions. Whatever was happening here, it involved people who meant harm to both mother and child. In his culture, such threats were among the most serious that could be faced. The protection of mothers and children was a sacred responsibility that superseded personal safety or tribal boundaries. Wicasa stopped and slowly raised his hands. Speaking in careful English, learned from years of trading with settlers and serving as translator during treaty negotiations. "I am not here to hurt you, but you will die here without help, and so will your child. You don't understand." Josephine gasped as another contraction seized her. "They're coming for us? My husband and his brothers. They want to sell my baby to pay gambling debts, and they'll kill me to keep their secret safe." The explanation hit Wicasa like a physical blow. In all his years as a healer, he'd encountered many forms of human cruelty, but the deliberate exploitation of pregnant women and newborn children never failed to ignite his deepest anger. Such acts violated not just civil law, but natural law, the fundamental bonds that held communities together. "How long have the pains been coming?" he asked, moving slowly closer while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "Since dawn," she replied through gritted teeth. "But they're getting stronger, closer together. The baby's coming whether I'm ready or not." Wicasa nodded grimly. He'd assisted at many births in his tribe, and he could see this one wouldn't wait for safer circumstances. The child was already crowning. He could see the signs in the way Josephine held herself, the particular quality of her breathing, the desperate focus in her eyes that meant transition was imminent. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "Trust me to help you bring your child safely into this world, or try to face what's coming alone. But choose quickly. Your enemies are getting closer, and your baby won't wait much longer." As if summoned by his words, Marcus's voice carried clearly through the afternoon air. "Found more blood over here. She's definitely wounded, probably holed up somewhere close." Josephine's grip on the knife relaxed slightly as she met Wicasa's steady gaze. Something in his manner, the calm competence, the obvious medical knowledge, the complete lack of threat or predatory interest, convinced her that he was telling the truth about wanting to help. "Please," she whispered, "help us both." Wicasa moved with practiced efficiency, his hands gentle but sure as he assessed Josephine's condition. The gunshot wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, and the bullet had passed through the fleshy part of her thigh without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He could see entry and exit wounds, both still bleeding but not catastrophically so. Using strips torn from his own shirt, he created a pressure bandage that would slow the bleeding to a manageable level. The fabric was clean, he'd washed it that morning in a stream, and he added a pinch of powdered sage from his medicine pouch to help prevent infection. "The bullet went clean through," he told her as he worked. "That's good, no fragments to worry about. But you've lost blood, and that makes everything more dangerous." The birth itself presented more complex challenges. Through careful examination, Wicasa determined that the baby was positioned feet first rather than head down, a breech presentation that significantly increased the risks for both mother and child. "Your baby is coming backward," he explained. "This makes it harder but not impossible. I've delivered breech babies before, but I need your complete trust and cooperation." Using his hunting knife, he cut away the torn and blood-soaked fabric of her dress, then gathered armfuls of the driest, cleanest corn husks he could find to create a makeshift birthing bed in a small clearing where the stalks had been flattened by some long-ago storm. The shade was minimal, but better than open ground under the punishing afternoon sun. From his medicine pouch, Wicasa withdrew several items his grandmother had taught him to carry: a leather cord for supporting the mother's belly, soft pieces of doe skin for wrapping the newborn, and a small obsidian blade, sharper than any steel knife, for cutting the umbilical cord when the time came. "This will help support you during the strongest pains," he said, wrapping the cord around her belly in a specific pattern. "When the next contraction comes, breathe like this." He demonstrated the breathing technique: short, shallow breaths during the peak of pain, followed by one long, slow exhale as it subsided. Josephine tried to follow his instructions, but the pain was overwhelming, and she could hear the searchers getting closer. Through the corn stalks, she caught glimpses of movement: brown clothing, the glint of rifle barrels, the steady approach of men who meant to do them harm. "They're going to find us," she panted between contractions. "You should run while you can. Save yourself." "Running is not always the answer to danger," Wicasa replied. From his belt, he drew a bone-handled knife and placed it in her trembling hands. "Hold this. Keep it hidden. If anyone comes who is not me, use it to protect your child." "Where are you going?" "To improve our odds." He melted back into the corn stalks as silently as he'd arrived, leaving Josephine alone with her fear and the growing intensity of her labor. The first of her pursuers appeared just as another contraction peaked. Tom Hutchins emerged from the corn like a predator, scenting blood, his rifle held ready, and his eyes scanning the clearing with lazy confidence. At 26, he was the youngest of the brothers, broad-shouldered and cruel-eyed, with the kind of swagger that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. He'd always been the most violent of the three, quick with his fists, and even quicker with crude jokes at others' expense. Abel used him for the kind of work that required brutality rather than subtlety, and Tom took obvious pleasure in causing pain to those weaker than himself. "Well, well," he called out, nudging closer while keeping his rifle trained in her general direction. "Look what we got here. Little Josephine trying to drop her bastard in a cornfield like some animal." Josephine gripped the bone knife tighter, trying to steady her breathing as Wicasa had taught her. "Stay back, Tom. I've got a weapon." "A weapon?" Tom laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Girl, you can barely sit up, let alone fight. Look at you, half dead from blood loss, belly torn open with childbirth. You couldn't hurt a fly in your condition." He dismounted and ground-tied his horse, then settled himself on a fallen log about 20 feet away, clearly intending to wait for the birth before taking any action. "Take your time," he said with false generosity. "I got all day, and this is actually kind of entertaining. Never seen a baby born before." "Why," Josephine gasped between waves of pain. "Why do you want to hurt an innocent child?" "Hurt it?" Tom seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. We're not going to hurt it. We're going to sell it to nice folks who'll give it a good home and pay us well for the privilege. $2,000 to be exact. And me, Tom's expression grew more serious. Well, that's a more complicated question. See, you know things about our family that could cause us some embarrassment if they got out. Can't have that. He was leaning forward now, elbows on his knees, studying her, with the kind of cold interest a scientist might show in a laboratory specimen. Abel's got some ideas about how to handle that particular problem. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business. That's when Wicasa struck. Rising from the corn stalks behind Tom like shadow-given substance, the Indian moved with lethal grace. His stone tomahawk, a weapon passed down from his grandfather, caught the afternoon sun for just an instant before it buried itself in the base of Tom's skull with a wet final sound. Tom Hutchins died without even knowing he was under attack. His body pitched forward off the log and lay still in the dirt, blood pooling beneath his head. Wicasa quickly dragged the corpse into the corn and retrieved Tom's rifle and ammunition belt. The weapon was a Henry repeating rifle well maintained and fully loaded 15 shots, plus what was in Tom's belt. It was far superior to Wicasa's own single-shot hunting rifle. One less, he told Josephine as he returned to her side, checking the rifle's action to familiarize himself with its operation. But the others will have heard his horse whinny when he dismounted. They'll know something's wrong when he doesn't respond to their calls. How many bullets? She asked, another contraction building. 15 in the rifle, maybe 30 more on his belt. Wicasa replied, mentally calculating their resources. It should be enough if we're careful. What if it's not? Wicasa met her eyes with steady confidence. Then I'll make sure it is. Marcus Hutchins had learned caution the hard way fighting Apaches in Arizona Territory before drifting north to Nebraska to join his brother's operation. At 32, he was the middle brother in age, but the most experienced in violence, having survived 3 years of irregular warfare against some of the most skilled guerrilla fighters on the continent. When Tom failed to respond to his calls, Marcus immediately altered his approach. Instead of continuing his direct advance through the corn, he dismounted and began a careful flanking maneuver using the dried stalks for cover, while advancing in a zigzag pattern that would make him difficult to target. He developed these techniques hunting Apache warriors through the mountains of the Southwest, and they'd kept him alive when less careful men died in ambushes. The enemy he was facing now was unknown, but the tactical principles remained the same. Assume your opponent is dangerous, never present an easy target, and always have an escape route planned. Tom, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the field. Tom, answer me. What's your situation? When no response came, Marcus knew his youngest brother was either dead or incapacitated. Given the sounds he'd been hearing, the wet impact of metal on bone, the sudden silence where Tom's voice should have been, death seemed more likely. I know you're in there, whoever you are. Marcus announced, his voice calm and professional. Tom's gone quiet, which means you killed him. That's fine. He was getting sloppy anyway, and sloppy men don't live long in this business. He was moving closer now, using sound discipline and cover techniques that would have impressed his old army sergeants. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to step out where I can see you nice and slow, and we're going to have a conversation about my brother's property. No need for this to get any messier than it already has. Josephine tried to stifle a scream as another contraction seized her, but some sound escaped anyway. Marcus smiled grimly at the noise, using it to pinpoint her location more precisely. Sounds like we got here just in time for the blessed event. He called out, adjusting his approach vector to intercept the source of the sound. That's good, means the merchandise is still viable. The buyers don't want damaged goods. Wicasa had been circling around behind Marcus, but the man was too experienced to be caught off guard twice. The Indian's approach was nearly silent, But Marcus caught the whisper of cloth against dried leaves and spun just as Wicasa closed the final distance. Marcus's rifle boomed in the confined space between the corn rows. The bullet creased Wicasa's shoulder, spinning him sideways and disrupting his attack. Before the Indian could recover, Marcus had worked the lever and chambered another round. "There we go," Marcus said with satisfaction, drawing a bead on Wicasa's center mass. "Now drop that rifle and step back real slow. We need to have a talk about what you've cost me." Wicasa let Tom's weapon fall and raised his hands, blood seeping through his shirt from the bullet graze. "The woman is giving birth. She needs medical attention, not violence. The woman's been nothing but trouble since the day Abel brought her home." Marcus replied, keeping his rifle steady while he evaluated the tactical situation. "And that baby she's carrying is going to solve a lot of problems for our family." "What kind of problems require the sale of children?" Marcus's smile was cold as winter wind. "The kind that come from owing serious money to serious men. You ever been to Kansas City, Indian? Ever seen what happens to folks who can't pay their debts?" He was moving closer to Josephine now, who was struggling to stay conscious through waves of pain and blood loss. The baby was crowning. Wicasa could see the top of its head beginning to emerge, but she was too weak to push effectively. "Those Kansas City boys, they're not the patient type." Marcus continued as if discussing the weather. "They give you a deadline, and if you don't meet it, they start removing pieces of your family until you find the motivation to pay up. Abel owes them $1,500, and our note comes due next week." "Please," Josephine whispered, "don't hurt my baby." "You heard it." Marcus seemed genuinely puzzled by the suggestion. "Lady, this baby's our salvation. $2,000 from the Weatherby family, no questions asked. Enough to pay our debts and have seed money left over for the next venture. What happens to me? Well, that's the tricky part." Marcus admitted, glancing between Josephine and Wicasa while maintaining tactical awareness of his surroundings. "You know too much about our business arrangements. In a perfect world, we'd just relocate you somewhere far away and trust you to keep quiet. But the world ain't perfect, and women have a tendency to talk when they shouldn't." The baby chose that moment to crown fully, and Josephine let out a cry she couldn't suppress. Marcus looked down with professional interest, as if watching a business transaction reach its conclusion. "There we go," he said with satisfaction. "Right on schedule." But his momentary distraction was exactly what Wicasa had been waiting for. The Indian grabbed a handful of dirt and debris and flung it at Marcus's face, while simultaneously diving to one side. Marcus's shot went wide, and by the time he'd cleared his eyes and worked the lever for another round, Wicasa had rolled behind the limited cover of a fallen fence post. "Oh, clever," Marcus called out, wiping grit from his eyes while scanning for movement. "But not clever enough. You're wounded, outgunned, and protecting a woman who can't move. This doesn't end well for you, friend." Wicasa was indeed in a difficult position. The fence post provided minimal cover, Marcus had superior firepower and position, and Josephine was entering the final stages of labor, whether they were ready or not. But he'd been in worse situations during his years as a warrior, and he'd learned that superior tactics could sometimes overcome superior firepower. Using the fence post as a pivot point, he began working his way toward a position where he could flank Marcus without exposing himself to direct fire. The movement was slow and careful. Any sudden motion would draw bullets, but it was progress. Marcus, meanwhile, was advancing steadily using fire and movement techniques to close the distance while maintaining pressure on his opponent. "You know what your problem is, Indian. You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. Makes you predictable." Another shot splintered wood near Wicasa's head, forcing him to adjust his position. Marcus was good, very good, and he was using professional military tactics that spoke of extensive combat experience. "See, most men fight for themselves." Marcus continued, his voice calm and conversational. despite the deadly nature of their engagement. Self-preservation, personal gain, simple survival. But you're fighting for that woman and her baby, which means you'll take risks I wouldn't take, make sacrifices I wouldn't make. He was right, and Wicasa knew it. Every tactical decision he made was influenced by the need to protect Josephine and her unborn child, which limited his options and made him more vulnerable to a skilled opponent who was fighting purely for personal objectives. But Marcus was also making an assumption that would prove fatal. He assumed that Wicasa's protective instincts made him weak, when in fact they made him more dangerous than any purely selfish fighter could ever be. When Wicasa finally moved, it wasn't the careful defensive maneuvering Marcus expected. Instead, the Indian exploded from cover, with reckless courage closing the distance between them faster than Marcus thought possible for a wounded man. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and weapons rolling in the dirt between the corn rows. Marcus was bigger and stronger, but Wicasa was fighting with the desperate strength that comes from protecting the innocent. And that made all the difference. The struggle was brief, but brutal. Marcus managed to get his hands around Wicasa's throat and began applying pressure. His face twisted with the effort of choking the life out of his opponent. For a moment, it looked like his superior size and strength would carry the day. But Wicasa had one advantage Marcus didn't know about: a small knife concealed in his boot, a weapon he'd carried since his warrior days and hoped never to use again. When Marcus's grip tightened around his throat and black spots began dancing at the edges of his vision, Wicasa drew the blade and drove it up under Marcus's ribs, finding the heart with the precision of long experience. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. He'd been winning, had been seconds away from victory, and couldn't understand how the situation had reversed so suddenly. Blood frothed from his lips as he tried to speak, but the only sound that emerged was a wet, choking gasp. For the children," Wicasa whispered, and Marcus Hutchins died with those words in his ears. The sudden silence was broken only by Josephine's labored breathing and a tiny, reedy cry, the first sound her newborn son made as he entered the world. "It's a boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face as she cradled the small, bloody infant against her chest. "He's alive. He's actually alive." Wicasa quickly cut the umbilical cord with his obsidian blade and wrapped the baby in the cleanest piece of doeskin he could find. The child was small, but appeared healthy, his cries growing stronger with each breath as his lungs adapted to breathing air instead of amniotic fluid. "Two down," Wicasa said, checking Marcus's body for additional weapons and ammunition. The dead man carried a pistol, extra cartridges, and a wicked-looking skinning knife that spoke of more violent uses than preparing game. "But where is the husband?" As if summoned by the question, Abel's voice echoed across the cornfield, much closer than before, and filled with cold fury that promised violence for whoever had interfered with his plans. "Marcus, Tom, I heard shooting, and it wasn't our guns doing the talking. You better have good news for me when I find you." Josephine was fading fast. The difficult birth combined with blood loss from her gunshot wound had left her pale as old bone, and her hands shook as she held her son against her chest. Wicasa knew she needed immediate medical attention and rest, but Abel was closing in fast, and they had nowhere left to run. "There's something you need to know," Josephine whispered, her voice barely audible above the baby's soft, mewling sounds. "About why they really planned all this. About Abel." Wicasa was dividing his attention between gathering supplies from the dead men and watching for signs of Abel's approach. The remaining brother would be more cautious now, having heard the gunfire and lost contact with his siblings. That made him more dangerous, not less. "Tell me quickly," he said, checking the loads in both captured rifles. Abel wasn't just desperate for money. She said, her words coming in short bursts between waves of exhaustion. He planned everything from the very beginning. The gambling, the debts, even what Marcus did to me. The words hit Wicasa like a physical blow. He'd assumed Abel was simply a desperate man making increasingly poor choices to solve his financial problems. The idea that someone would deliberately orchestrate such elaborate cruelty was almost beyond comprehension. You mean he arranged for his own brother to assault you? More than that. Josephine continued, her voice growing weaker as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. I thought Marcus attacked me because he was drunk and evil. But Abel planned it down to the smallest detail. He needed a baby to sell, but he also needed it to look legitimate. The full scope of Abel's plan was becoming clear, and it was more monstrous than Wicasa had imagined. If a stranger had gotten you pregnant, there would have been questions. Exactly. But if his own brother was the father and they could pass it off as Abel's child, then claim it died in childbirth while actually selling it, she couldn't finish, overcome by the sheer calculated evil of the scheme. And you're the only witness who knows the truth, Wicasa realized. That's why they have to kill you. Not just to cover up the baby sale, but to hide the original crime. Abel told Marcus it would solve two problems at once. Josephine confirmed. Get them the money they needed and eliminate the liability I represented. He said it took real courage to make the hard choices necessary for family survival. Wicasa looked down at the tiny infant, so innocent and unaware of the violence that had brought him into the world, and now threatened to take him out of it. In Lakota tradition, children were sacred gifts from the spirits, and their protection was a responsibility that fell on every adult in the tribe. The circumstances of this child's conception only made that responsibility more urgent. And then we make sure he fails completely, Wicasa said with quiet determination. But don't you see? Josephine's voice was growing weaker, and her grip on the baby was becoming less secure as consciousness threatened to slip away. Even if we survive today, there will always be others. Abel has connections, people who'll come looking when he doesn't return home. My baby will never be safe as long as anyone knows the truth about what happened here. Before Wicasa could respond, Abel's voice cut through the afternoon air, much closer now, and edged with the kind of controlled fury that promised systematic violence to whoever had cost him his brothers and his carefully laid plans. I can smell the blood from here. I know Marcus and Tom are dead, and I know you had help killing them. But that's fine. Saves me the trouble of splitting the money 3 ways. Now I just need to collect my property and clean up this mess. The revelation of Abel's true nature changed everything about their tactical situation. This wasn't just about preventing the sale of a child or stopping a desperate man from covering up a crime. This was about protecting an innocent boy from a monster who had orchestrated his conception as part of an elaborate scheme to settle gambling debts through the exploitation of human misery. Josephine met Wicasa's eyes, and he saw in them not just fear, but a terrible understanding of what they were really facing. He's not going to try to take us alive, she whispered. He can't afford to. Too many people dead, too much evidence. He's going to kill us both and find some other way to solve his money problems. Let him come, Wicasa replied, checking his weapons one final time. Some evils are too great to be allowed to continue. But even as he spoke, Wicasa knew they were facing nearly impossible odds. Abel would be cautious now, having found his brother's bodies and realized he was dealing with a skilled opponent. He'd have the advantage of superior position, better weapons, and nothing to lose. Worse, Josephine was in no condition to move, let alone fight, and the baby needed constant protection. Their only hope lay in choosing their ground carefully and forcing Abel to fight on their terms rather than his own. The abandoned grain shack at the edge of the field offered the only real shelter for miles around, but reaching it would mean crossing open ground while carrying a newborn infant and supporting a wounded woman. Can you walk? Wicasa asked. Josephine struggled to sit up, her face pale with effort and determination. I can try. Then we move now before he gets close enough to cut off our retreat. Abel Hutchins moved through the cornfield like a man who knew he was running out of time and options. At 31, he was the oldest and smartest of the three brothers, with the kind of weathered competence that came from surviving worse situations than this during his years as a cavalry sergeant in the Indian Wars. He'd heard the gunshots that marked his brothers' deaths, seen the crows gathering where their bodies lay, cooling in the afternoon heat. Professional assessment told him he was facing an opponent with real skill, someone who'd managed to kill 2 armed men in quick succession without taking fatal damage in return. The smart thing would be to withdraw, regroup, and come back with reinforcements. But Abel didn't have that luxury. Too many people knew about his gambling debts, and the Kansas City boys weren't the type to extend deadlines out of sympathy. If he didn't deliver the promised payment within the next few days, he'd be joining his brothers in death, and it wouldn't be quick or clean. That left him with 2 choices: capture Josephine and her baby alive, and try to salvage some version of his original plan, or eliminate all witnesses and find another way to raise the money he needed. Given the tactical situation and the unknown capabilities of whoever was helping his wife, the second option was looking more practical. He'd found Marcus first recognizing immediately that someone with real fighting experience had killed his brother. The knife wound was precise and delivered with knowledge of human anatomy, not the wild slashing of an amateur, but the professional work of someone who'd killed before. Tom's body told a similar story. The tomahawk blow that had caved in his skull was perfectly placed and delivered with enough force to kill instantly. Their unknown enemy was skilled, experienced, and comfortable with violence. That made him dangerous in a way that went beyond simple desperation. But Abel had advantages too. He knew this country better than any stranger could understood the tactical possibilities of every hill and gully for miles around. He had superior weapons, a Spencer repeating rifle, and 2 Colt revolvers taken from dead Confederate officers during the war. Most importantly, he was fighting for his own survival rather than trying to protect vulnerable people, which gave him tactical flexibility his opponent lacked. The blood trail was easy to follow. Josephine was badly wounded and couldn't move far or fast in her condition. The Indian helping her and Abel was certain it was an Indian based on the weapons and fighting techniques involved, would be slowed by the need to support her and protect the newborn. That meant they'd have to find shelter soon, and there was only one place in the immediate area that offered real protection from rifle fire. The old grain shack had been abandoned for years, but its walls were thick enough to stop bullets, and it had only one entrance that could be defended. It was also a trap. Once inside, they'd have cover but no escape route. Abel could pin them down with rifle fire and wait for hunger, thirst, or medical emergency to force them into the open. Then, it would just be a matter of finishing what he'd started. The approaching hoofbeats told Josephine and Wakasa that Abel had found his brothers' bodies and was now tracking them directly. The abandoned grain shack loomed ahead, offering shelter, but also the risk of being trapped with no escape route. "It's our only choice," Wakasa said, supporting Josephine as she struggled across the open ground between the cornfield and the building. "We can't outrun him in your condition." The baby had gone quiet, exhausted by his traumatic entry into the world, but his breathing was steady and strong. That was something, at least. If they could keep him alive through the next few hours, he might have a chance at a future free from the violence that had marked his birth. The grain shack's interior was a chaos of rotting boards, rusted farm tools, and debris from years of neglect. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the walls, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that would provide some concealment but little real protection. An old scythe hung from a peg near the door, its blade nicked but still sharp. Coils of rope lay scattered in one corner, and a broken plow dominated the center of the space. "They'll try to pin us down and wait us out," Wakasa said, examining their surroundings for anything that might serve as weapons or defensive positions. "We need to make him come to us on our terms." "What terms?" Josephine asked, settling into a corner where she could protect the baby while still having a clear view of the entrance. He has better weapons, better position, and all the time in the world. He also has a deadline. Wikasa pointed out. You said he owes money to dangerous men. That means he can't afford to wait too long, or his creditors will come looking for him. Before Josephine could respond, Abel's voice carried clearly through the gaps in the walls closer than they'd expected. I know you're in there. Found the blood trail leading right to your door. Didn't take much tracking, you left a path a blind man could follow. There was something different in his tone now, a cold confidence that hadn't been there before. He'd assessed the tactical situation and liked his odds. Here's what's going to happen. Abel continued, his voice calm and conversational. I'm going to give you one chance to surrender peacefully. Come out with your hands up and maybe we can work something out. Stay in there and I'll burn you out like rats from a barn. He's bluffing. Wikasa said quietly. Fire would destroy everything he's trying to protect. Would it? Josephine asked. And there was something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. What if he's already decided that his original plan won't work? What if he's given up on selling the baby and is just trying to eliminate witnesses now? The possibility sent a chill through Wikasa's chest. If Abel had indeed abandoned his plan to sell the child, then he had no reason to keep any of them alive. A fire would destroy the evidence and provide a convenient explanation for the deaths, a tragic accident that claimed the lives of a desperate woman and the Indian who tried to help her. War 30 seconds, Abel called out. Then I start lighting kindling. We need to draw him inside. Josephine said, her voice growing stronger as adrenaline and maternal desperation overcame physical weakness. Make him come to us on our ground. How? Josephine was looking around the shack's interior with new interest, her eyes focusing on details she'd missed before. The rope, the tools, the layout of the building. Abel always was too confident for his own good. Maybe we can use that against him. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about what my father taught me about hunting dangerous animals, she replied, and for the first time since he'd met her, Wikasa heard something in her voice that wasn't fear or desperation. It was calculation, cold and precise. You don't fight them on their terms. You create a situation where their strengths become weaknesses. 15 seconds. Josephine was moving now, despite her wounds and exhaustion, gathering coils of rope and positioning them near the entrance, where they wouldn't be immediately visible to someone coming through the door. Abel's a soldier. He thinks in terms of direct assault, overwhelming firepower, frontal attacks. But this isn't a battlefield. 10 seconds. And this is a trap, Wikasa realized, understanding her plan. And we're the bait. 5. The first wisps of smoke began filtering through the gaps in the walls, confirming that Abel wasn't bluffing about the fire. But instead of the thick, choking smoke that would drive them out immediately, this was just enough to create urgency without making the building uninhabitable. He's trying to panic us, Josephine said. Make us run outside where he can pick us off easily. Time's up, Abel called out. Hope you made your peace with whatever gods you pray to. But instead of the roar of flames, they expected they heard something else. The careful sound of footsteps approaching the shack's entrance, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs and the whisper of clothing against wood. He's coming in? Wikasa breathed. Good. Josephine replied, and there was something fierce and final in her voice. Let him come. Abel Hutchins stepped through the shack's doorway, with the confident stride of a man who'd cleared hostile buildings before and knew how to minimize his exposure while maximizing his tactical advantage. His Spencer rifle was held at the ready, and his eyes swept the interior in a practiced pattern designed to identify threats and escape routes simultaneously. What he saw was exactly what he'd expected: his wife huddled in a corner with her newborn bastard looking half dead from blood loss and exhaustion. The Indian crouched beside her, clutching a rifle, but clearly wounded and at the end of his resources. Two desperate people trapped with nowhere to run and no good options remaining. Well now, Abel said, keeping his weapon trained on Wicasa while evaluating the tactical situation. Looks like my wife found herself some help. Too bad it wasn't enough. The smoke from his small fire was beginning to drift through the gaps in the walls, but it wasn't the immediate threat he'd made it sound like. Abel was too smart to destroy the building while he was inside it, and he had better ways of ending this standoff than burning everyone alive. You cost me my brothers. He continued moving deeper into the shack, while maintaining careful spacing and clear fields of fire. That's a debt that needs paying. Wicasa slowly raised his hands, but his eyes never left Abel's face. Your brothers were trying to murder a woman and her newborn child. They got what they deserved. Abel's laugh was harsh and humorless. What they deserved was to live long enough to collect payment for services rendered. What they got was killed by an Indian who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. The child is innocent of whatever crimes you think justify this. Wicasa replied. Children are sacred in all cultures. Even yours must have some protection for the helpless. Sacred. Abel's expression grew genuinely amused. Indian, that baby's not sacred. It's merchandise. $2,000 worth of merchandise that I can't sell anymore thanks to your interference. He was close enough now that missing would be impossible. But instead of firing immediately, he seemed to want to talk. That gave Josephine hope. Men who wanted to talk were men who could be distracted, and distracted men made mistakes. So what happens now? She asked, her voice weak but steady. Now I clean up this mess and figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage. Abel replied. Starting with you, Indian. You killed my brothers, which means you die slow and hard. And your wife and child? Abel's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were working through a complex problem with multiple variables. Well, that's more complicated. I can't sell the baby now. Too much attention, too many questions. And I can't let Josephine live, because she knows too much about family business. You're going to kill your own child. It's not my child, Abel said flatly. It's Marcus's bastard conceived for a purpose that's no longer viable. Just another mouth to feed that I can't afford. The casual way he dismissed the infant's life was exactly what Josephine had been counting on. Abel's complete lack of paternal feeling meant he wouldn't be careful about protecting the baby during whatever violence was about to unfold, and that might give her the opening she needed. You want to know the funny part? Abel continued, seemingly in no hurry to finish his business. I was actually starting to think this might work out. $2,000 would have solved all our problems and given us a fresh start somewhere else. Could have been a real family, maybe even had legitimate children eventually. What stopped you? Wicasa asked, though he was really asking to buy time while assessing their dwindling options. You did, Abel replied simply. Couple dead brothers and a gun battle in a cornfield tends to attract unwanted attention. Can't sell stolen merchandise when half the territory knows there's been trouble. He was moving closer now, clearly intending to end the conversation and get down to the serious business of revenge. But as he stepped forward, his boot caught the rope Josephine had positioned near the entrance. It wasn't much, just a moment of imbalance, a slight stumble, that threw off his aim for perhaps 2 seconds. But 2 seconds was enough for a desperate woman fighting for her child's life. Josephine lunged upward from her corner, not toward Abel, but toward the old scythe hanging on the wall. Her hands closed around the wooden handle just as Abel recovered his balance and tried to bring his rifle to bear. The blade caught him across the forearms, not deep enough to disable, but painful enough to disrupt his shot. The bullet went wide, punching through the shack's wall instead of finding human flesh. You bitch, Abel snarled, dropping the rifle and drawing one of his pistols. I was going to make it quick, but now... He never finished the threat. Wicasa had used Josephine's distraction to close the distance between them, and now he hit Abel low and hard, driving him backward into the shack's far wall with bone-crushing force. They went down together, rolling across the debris-covered floor, each fighting desperately for control of Abel's remaining weapons. Abel was bigger and stronger, but Wicasa was more experienced in close combat and had the advantage of fighting for something beyond his own survival. The struggle was brutal and desperate. Abel managed to get his hands around Wicasa's throat and began applying pressure. His face twisted with murderous determination. The Indian's vision began to darken as his air supply was cut off, and for a moment, it looked like Abel's superior size and strength would carry the day. But Josephine wasn't finished fighting. Despite her wounds and exhaustion, she managed to retrieve Abel's fallen rifle and work the lever to chamber a fresh cartridge. The weapon was heavier than anything she'd ever handled before, and her hands shook with weakness as she tried to aim. Her first shot went wide, splintering wood near the struggling men, but accomplishing nothing except making her ears ring. But the sound was enough to distract Abel, momentarily loosening his grip on Wicasa's throat, just enough for the Indian to break free. Wicasa rolled away from Abel's grasping hands and came up with the broken plow handle he'd noticed earlier. The improvised club caught Abel across the side of his head, stunning him long enough for Wicasa to gain a decisive advantage. But Abel was tougher than his brothers had been, and he recovered quickly. Instead of trying to grapple again, he drew his second pistol and put 3 quick shots into the space where he thought his opponents were hiding. One bullet caught Wicasa in the thigh, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. Another splintered the wall near Josephine's head, showering her with fragments of rotten wood. The third went wild, embedding itself in the shack's sagging roof. "Enough!" Abel roared, standing over them with his smoking pistol. Blood streamed from the scythe wound on his arms and the club blow to his head, but he was still functional and very dangerous. "I'm done playing games." He aimed the pistol at Josephine's head, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Say goodbye to your bastard wife. You're about to join him." That's when Josephine did something that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of cowering or pleading, she looked Abel straight in the eyes and spoke with absolute calm. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Pull that trigger. But know that when you do, you'll be killing the only person who ever tried to make your miserable life mean something." Abel's hand wavered slightly. "What? I loved you." Josephine continued, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. "When I married you, I actually thought I could make you happy. I cooked your meals, mended your clothes, tried to be the wife you needed. And how did you repay that love?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Abel replied, but there was something uncertain in his voice now. "I know you arranged for your own brother to rape me," Josephine said with devastating directness. "I know you planned to sell my baby like livestock to pay your gambling debts. I know you intended to murder me to cover up your crimes. Tell me, Abel, what part of that sounds like love to you?" For a moment, something flickered in Abel's eyes that might have been shame or regret. But it was quickly replaced by the cold hardness that had driven him to orchestrate such elaborate cruelty in the first place. "Love don't pay debts," he said simply. "And dead men don't need love anyway." He raised the pistol again, but this time Wicasa was ready for him. Using his good leg to launch himself forward, the Indian tackled Abel around the waist, driving both of them into a pile of rotting grain sacks. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air as they fell, but Abel maintained his grip on the weapon and tried to bring it to bear again. Wicasa grabbed his wrist, and they struggled desperately for control, while Josephine watched in horror, clutching her baby and trying to find an opening to help. "The knife," Wicasa gasped, nodding toward his belt where the obsidian blade still rested. "Get the knife." But Josephine had a better idea. Abel's rifle lay where she dropped it after her missed shot still loaded and ready to fire. Summoning the last of her strength, she crawled across the shack's floor and picked up the weapon. This time she took careful aim, steadying the rifle against a broken beam and focusing on the center of Abel's back. Her husband was on top of Wicasa, now pressing the pistol toward the Indian's head, while Wicasa fought desperately to keep the barrel pointed away from his skull. Josephine's second shot took Abel just below the shoulder blade, the heavy bullet punching through his lung and heart, before exiting through his chest in a spray of blood and bone fragments. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of mild surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. "Josephine," he whispered, reaching toward her with one blood-slicked hand. I actually did love you. In my own way, I really did love you." She watched him die without saying a word, her face expressionless as the light faded from his eyes, and his hand fell to the floor with a soft thud. The silence that followed was profound. No gunshots, no shouting, no sounds of struggle. Just the whisper of wind through broken boards and the soft breathing of a newborn child who had survived his first day in a violent world. "Is it over?" Josephine asked, though she already knew the answer. "For them, yes," Wicasa replied, pressing a torn piece of cloth against his wounded thigh to slow the bleeding. "For you and your son, it's just beginning." The smoke from Abel's abandoned fire had dissipated, but the smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, like a testament to the violence that had just ended. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. "What do we do now?" Josephine asked. "And now we disappear," Wicasa said firmly. "When people come to investigate the gunfire, they'll find 3 dead men and evidence of a fight. But they won't find you or your baby because you were never here." "Where will we go?" "North," Wicasa replied without hesitation. "To my people. They'll welcome a mother and child who need protection, and they'll ask no questions about what happened here." From his medicine pouch, Wicasa withdrew the items he'd been saving for this moment: dried corn for sustenance during their journey, sage leaves for healing Josephine's wounds, and a small carved wooden token that he pressed into her trembling hands. "For your son," he said quietly. "So he will remember that he was born from courage, not from shame." Josephine looked at the token, a piece of cedar carved with symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light. "What does it mean?" "In my language, it means survivor," Wicasa explained. "It is a good name for a boy who fought so hard to live, and an even better name for the woman who fought to save him." They left the grain shack as the sun touched the horizon, Wicasa supporting Josephine, while she carried her son toward an uncertain but hopeful future. Behind them, the evidence of their ordeal remained: 3 bodies, scattered weapons, and the lingering smell of violence that would soon draw investigators from town. But by the time Sheriff Morgan and his deputies arrived the next morning, following reports of sustained gunfire from multiple witnesses, they found only what Wicasa had intended them to find: evidence of a deadly confrontation between the Hutchins brothers and unknown attackers who'd left no trace of their identity or whereabouts. The official story, as recorded in the sheriff's report, was both simpler and more complex than the truth. The Hutchins brothers had been involved in illegal activities, gambling, likely some cattle rustling, possibly worse. Their violent deaths were the inevitable result of such a lifestyle. And while regrettable, they served as a warning to others who might be tempted by similar pursuits. No mention was made of planned child selling, systematic sexual assault, or the elaborate conspiracy to exploit a young woman's vulnerability for financial gain. Such details would only complicate the investigation and cause unnecessary pain for any surviving family members. Abel's wife and newborn child were listed as missing, presumed dead. Their bodies were never found, leading to speculation that they'd been killed elsewhere, and their remains disposed of in the vast emptiness of the prairie. It was a common enough fate for women and children caught up in frontier violence, tragic, but not particularly unusual. The truth was filed away, with the official papers and the story that survived became part of local legend, another tale of frontier justice and the inevitable consequences of living outside the law. 2 months later, Josephine stood at the edge of a Lakota encampment near the Niobrara River, her son healthy and growing strong in her arms. The journey north had been difficult, but not impossible. Wikasa's knowledge of the country and his reputation among various tribes had opened doors that would have remained closed to a white woman traveling alone. She'd learned during their travels that Wikasa was more than just a wandering healer. His full name was Thomas Crow Feather, and he was a graduate of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, who'd chosen to return to traditional ways after seeing too much of what white civilization had to offer. He moved freely between both worlds, serving as translator-mediator and healer to anyone who needed his services, regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. "You could stay in the white world," he'd told her during one of their rest stops. "Change your name, move to a distant city, start over where no one knows your history. And always be looking over my shoulder." Josephine had replied, "Always wondering if someone from my past might recognize me. No, thank you. I want my son to grow up somewhere he'll be accepted for who he is, not judged for circumstances beyond his control." Now, as she approached the Lakota camp with its circle of lodges and smoke from cooking fires, Josephine felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the possibility of belonging somewhere, of being part of a community that would accept her and her child without questions or conditions. An elderly woman emerged from one of the lodges and approached them with the careful politeness reserved for strangers. Her weathered face was kind but cautious, and her eyes took in every detail of Josephine's appearance and condition. Through a mixture of English hand signs and Wikasa's translation, the woman who introduced herself as Winona, meaning firstborn daughter, welcomed them to the camp and listened to an abbreviated version of their story. The details were vague and diplomatic, but the essential truth came through clearly. This was a mother and child who needed protection from violent men, and they'd found a defender in Thomas Crow Feather. That was enough for Winona and the other tribal elders. In Lakota culture, the protection of mothers and children was a sacred responsibility that transcended individual tribal boundaries. A woman who'd fought to save her child's life and succeeded with the help of one of their own people was welcome among them, regardless of her race or background. "You can stay as long as you wish," Winona told Josephine through Wikasa's translation. "We have need of young mothers, and your boy will grow strong here among people who understand the value of courage." But there was one more surprise waiting. As they settled into the lodge that had been prepared for them, a young boy approached shyly and handed Josephine a bundle wrapped in the soft deerskin. "Thomas Crow Feather said to give you this when you were ready," the boy explained in careful English. Inside the bundle, Josephine found several items that took her breath away. The original wooden token Wikasa had carved for her son, but now elaborately decorated with additional symbols and inlaid with small pieces of turquoise and silver. There was also a set of traditional baby clothes, sized for a growing infant, a small parfleche container filled with medicinal herbs, and a second carving that depicted a wolf protecting a den full of cubs. But the most precious item was a letter written in Wikasa's educated hand. "To the mother of survivor, your son carries within him the strength of all those who refuse to let evil triumph. He is not defined by the violence of his conception, but by the courage of his survival and the love that protected him when he was most vulnerable. I have given him a Lakota name, Tatanka Najin, which means standing buffalo, to honor his strength and the way he stood firm against those who would have destroyed him before he could live. But his true name will always be survivor, and his true heritage will always be courage. Raise him to know that his worth comes not from the circumstances of his beginning, but from the choices he makes with his life. Teach him both languages, both cultures, so that he may serve as a bridge between worlds that too often see only their differences. The people will always have a place for him should he ever need refuge or wish to learn the old ways." He is one of us now, marked by courage and protected by love. May he grow tall and strong and wise, and may he always remember that his first victory was simply choosing to live. Warstas Thomas Crow Feather called also Wikasa healer and friend to all who fight for justice. Winona gestured toward the camp with a welcoming smile. The healer has honored your son greatly. Such a blessing is not given lightly. Josephine looked down at her sleeping baby, then at the faces around her, weathered by wind and sun, marked by hardship and loss, but filled with the kind of acceptance she'd never found in the white world. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she might have found not just safety, but a true home. Years later, when her son had grown into a strong and wise young man who moved easily between the white and Indian worlds, people would ask Josephine if she ever regretted the choices she'd made that terrible day in the cornfield. She would smile and look at her boy, tall and proud and kind, fluent, in both English and Lakota, equally comfortable in a court of law, and around a council fire, and give the same answer every time. I regret nothing. Every scar was worth his life, and every choice led us to where we belonged. And when visitors to the camp asked about the wooden token her son always wore around his neck, Josephine would tell them the story of how he'd earned his name. This is Tatanka Najin Standing Buffalo, called also Survivor. He was born in violence, but raised in love, saved by courage, and protected by justice. He is living proof that our children are not defined by how they enter this world, but by how they choose to live in it. The token itself had become something of a legend among the Lakota, passed down through generations as a symbol of the triumph of good over evil, of protection over exploitation, of love over violence. Children would touch it for luck, and young mothers would whisper prayers to the spirits that their own babies might grow up to be as strong and wise as the boy who'd survived his first day in a world that tried to destroy him. But for Josephine, the token's true meaning was simpler and more personal. It represented the moment when she'd stopped being a victim and become a protector, when fear had transformed into fierce determination, when she'd learned that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing danger alone, but from accepting help from unexpected sources. She never saw Wikasa again after that first week in the camp, though she heard stories of his travels and good works throughout the territory. He continued his life as a wandering healer, helping anyone who needed assistance, regardless of their race or circumstances, carrying on the ancient tradition of serving those who had no one else to turn to. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right across the prairie, Josephine thought she could hear his voice, reminding her of the truth he'd spoken in that abandoned grain shack her son was born from, courage not from shame, and that would always be his greatest inheritance. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when she held her growing boy and felt his strong, steady heartbeat against her chest, Josephine would whisper the same prayer of gratitude she'd learned from Winona. Thank you, spirits, for the gift of this child. Thank you for the courage to protect him. Thank you for the wisdom to know that love is always stronger than hate, and that good people still exist in this world when we need them most.